Tēnā koutou. All research, in a sense, is historical. All disciplines draw on work that has gone before. What distinguishes the work of historians is that in order to understand a disappeared past, we have to piece together a narrative from imagining what surviving patchy sources, usually unintended for historians' eyes, reveal to us. Those sources are even more fragmentary when they are to do with women and their bodies. My research lies at the intersection of women's history and the history of medicine. Originally, I was driven to uncover the hidden history of backstreet or self-induced abortion, which meant exploring how women understood their bodies and fertility control. The medical profession, which prescribed the pill in the 1970s at the time I began this research, opposed birth control in the 1870s. What then had changed? Doctors played a role in both criminalizing and policing abortion in 19th century England, and then became advocates for the 1967 English liberalisation of the law. What made acts illegal in the 1880s into acceptable procedures by the late 1960s? History demands a wide field of analysis, and these kinds of questions led me to investigate lawmaking, sexual practices, attitudes to birth control, and women's responses to unplanned pregnancies. Parliamentary investigations, police court depositions, medical and legal journals, and oral histories were the kinds of sources that I drew on for my inquiry. At the outset of my PhD research on abortion in interwar England, a woman in her 60s told me, "I never had an abortion, but I got rid of 3. When I gently inquired further, the woman said that she had brought on her period by various means. I immediately saw that my understanding of a bodily event was very different to that held by a working class woman in the 1930s. Part of the historian's task is to remove modern blinders and enter a world that thinks and speaks very differently. My interest in sickness and health led me to study what was known in the 19th century as lunacy and the role of asylum doctors, an area of ongoing research. I have repeatedly returned to the life story of Johanna Beckett, admitted a number of times to the Seacliff Asylum, who you see here. The medical superintendent, Frederick Truby King, recorded her answer to his request to take a photograph in 1890. She said, "I suppose you want a picture of a mad woman. I'd better stick some straw in my hair and make faces." That startling self-awareness of the representation of mental illness stood out in an archive when often patients' voices are deemed to be incoherent and raving. In the asylum, Johanna Beckett had respite from a husband who bet her and demanded that she be ruled by him. In her case, the asylum, which supposedly catered to the mind, may well also have offered a kind of freedom from the bruises he inflicted on her flesh. Asking how women understood their bodies led to joint research with Margaret Tennant to investigate what was, in most of the 20th century, the intensely private experience of menstruation with its own freighted terminology, from being unwell, the monthlies, to the curse and Bloody Mary. That investigation shed light on generational divides between mothers and daughters, on ideas about hygiene, the modern woman, and the shift from home production of sanitary towels to industrially produced, mass-marketed consumer goods. Who would have thought that the 1951 waterfront dispute led to a sanitary pad crisis as supplies of gauze and cellulose were held up in the docks? This history matters because women were restricted from all sorts of opportunities in education and employment, and even the simple pleasures of bathing and eating ice cream because of beliefs about menstruation. That we are now able to publicly discuss period poverty signals a new language, highlighting an old issue. Ideas about bodily shame led me to investigate the gendered reactions to the birth of children whose bodies or minds were deemed to be different from the norm and might be categorized in the first half of the 20th century as idiots, imbeciles, and cripples. How did it feel when one's own flesh failed to measure up? The mid-20th century medical solution was often institutionalization. Mothers sometimes had to choose between losing their children or losing their husbands, who might threaten to leave if a child was not institutionalized. A large-scale New Zealand survey carried out in the early 1970s indicated that mothers had sole responsibility for a considerable proportion of those by then described as intellectually handicapped. Māori families, where support of the wider kin group was expected and available, were much less likely to choose institutionalization for their children. Intergenerational care was a more likely solution, as was the case of a 70-year-old Māori woman living in a rural township, caring for her 20-year-old great-grandson, whom she had reared from childhood. The Intellectually Handicapped Children's Parents Association, founded in 1949 by Margaret and Harold Anion, worked hard to overturn the shame attached to disability, providing a framework for the current social rather than medical model of disability. Bodies are constantly on display in film, and I investigated the origins and purpose of health department educational films, including tuberculosis and the Māori people of the Wairoa district. This was a 1952 film made as an innovative cooperative venture by the Department of Health, the Ngāti Kahungunu Tribal District Committee, and the National Film Unit. In this case, the aim was to undress the flesh, to encourage people to have their lungs x-rayed in the mobile x-ray unit. The film aimed to convince local people of preventive measures to stem the spread of tuberculosis, which was rife in their community. Māori deaths from tuberculosis were 10 times higher than those of Pākehā. Film held out the promise of transforming individual health practices, with the result that the individual body would be integrated into the wider transformation of the social body. My current project, a book about the life of an extraordinary American woman doctor, Anna Longshaw Potts, who in the 1880s and 1890s toured the English-speaking world giving lectures to ladies about their bodies, is absorbing much of my time. She was particularly concerned that that female patients found it difficult to tell male doctors of their symptoms, believing the difference of sex was an almost insurmountable barrier between a woman's diseases and a doctor's correct diagnosis of them. When she visited New Zealand with her charts like this in 1883 and then later in 1893, there were no women doctors available, but she stood as a harbinger of change. Her 19th century words of warning about male doctors' arrogance in the face of women's concerns remained pertinent in the 20th century, highlighted by the 1988 Cartwright Report. As I've written, that report helped reshape aspects of our health system. When working on a history of women in New Zealand, I became particularly aware of how the records that revealed Māori women's lives were rare in the kinds of sources I was trained to use. What did become apparent was the way reproductive work has traditionally been downplayed, yet it is so central to our history. The revitalised Māori population over the 20th century relied on the work of mothers and whānau in raising healthy children. Those mothers were assisted from the 1940s to the 1970s by a welfare state which paid a child benefit directly to mothers. The daily tending to the bodies of others, such as bathing and feeding small children or assisting the elderly, has been work mainly done by women. That intimate work of caring for the flesh of others, so long ignored but highlighted by COVID, has a history which remains underexplored. Fleshing out the bones of history, I argue, means taking into account this quotidian but remarkable work of women. Thank you.